Sounds good. We can start again. You were saying about
I was kind of saying that it seemed like solid state drives were kind of a sweet spot for the last couple of decades. During a period when storage needs weren't growing very rapidly, they were growing over time. How much information you store on your phone might have gone up 10x, maybe over the last decade or two. Definitely not like doubling every year.
not like 100x.
Not 100x, not 1000x. Hard drives are kind of like a little bit more finicky in solid state. They're maybe like around 5x cheaper per unit of storage. They're a bit slower. Also, they're like a little bit more prone to failure. You would probably need to replace them a little bit more often, depending on how you use it. None of those things are showstoppers. It's just 5x cheaper. So you actually need a lot of storage. I think increasingly companies will also be going to increase the size of the hard drive fleets. Also at the consumer level, I think people are going to find a lot of reasons to just buy another hard drive. But most of the revenue demand is going to come from data centers, large companies, clouds, etc.
What's the current breakdown of Western Digital Seagate's revenue between enterprise and consumer? Off top?
I don't know off the top of my head. I would strongly suspect it's mostly going to be enterprise right now.
Because not too many people. It's probably 90-10. How many people buy these things nowadays?
Yeah, it's kind of a niche product. It's like,
right.
Do you know about backups? Do you like do them yourself? Are you a content producer, or are you doing your own videos, things like that?
In terms of the moat for these hard drive makers, there's only like 3 of them, as you said. Do they have a high moat in terms of a technology barrier, or it's just not worthwhile for somebody like NVIDIA or Micron to start this hard drive business, restart this?
It's like pretty specialized. That's what we saw. I think it was Seagate, was it? That had it was SanDisk and Seagate, I believe. They split off SanDisk.
That's right.
So they actually had hard drives and SSDs in the same house, and they decided to break it apart because there's not really much synergy.
I think it was Western Digital that spun off SanDisk.
Oh, sorry,
but it's okay.
So there's not much synergy, like supply chain wise, between making a hard drive and making solid state drives.
Because they are completely different things?
They're basically completely different technologies. In terms of new entrants getting into the market, I would be surprised if we saw that in the West, because the trend is just towards more and more consolidation. It's hard to pitch to people. Why don't we compete against, in a mature industry, against entrenched competitors? That's just like very hard pitch to VCs, for example. Plausibly, China could do it. I think my thought there was more that China could probably stand up their own hard drive industry if they were motivated to. The US is happy to sell hard drives. It's not a strategic technology. It's not like AI chips. It's pretty well commoditized. There's no reason for China to do that.
What about the market size? Because Micron now is 10 times the size of Western Digital, for example. In terms of the market demand, sort of the data centers demand, do you think it's going to be 50-50? Do you think it's going to be like 70-30? In a sense, if you look at Micron, or what's that Korean company called? SK Hynix or something like
SK
that?
Hynix.
In terms of how big they are and how big hard drive makers are, like what's the sense? Can you give us a sense of how big those are?
That's actually a really good question. I don't have a strong sense for that. I think my current sense is that hard drive demand is going to increase quite a bit relative to the current level. It's also going to increase more relative to demand for SSDs. They're both seeing increasing demand as we see this AI boom. People are building data centers. People are standing up a lot of hardware. There's basically just constant demand for more SSD, more storage in general. I feel pretty strongly that we're going to see hard drives increase as a percentage of the mix inside of a data center. If you go to, for example, like Amazon right now, AWS, you can rent a cloud computer. Most of the time, you're going to get an SSD attached to that computer. That's like the default. You can get more storage. You can get hard drives allocated to you. You kind of have to go out of your way to do that. That's kind of where.
What do you mean? Like, say I go on Amazon, AWS, and I rent like one terabyte storage. Then what? Then
there's different ways to get attached storage on AWS. In fact, the way they give you storage is a little bit what we call it's a little bit abstracted, where they're like, here's some storage. This is kind of how fast it is. This is how much it'll cost you. So that they don't tell you if you're getting an SSD or you're getting a hard drive. They don't say that out. If you rent a computer and it's got storage attached to it, almost certainly it's going to be a solid state drive. If you start like putting a lot of data into their AWS's data layer, which is called S3. If you start like putting a bunch of data into S3, for example, some of that data is going to end up on hard disk drives, just because they get to decide to store it. We want to save some money.
Right? If you're using cloud, why does it matter whether it's SD or hard drive?
So for you might like not directly have control over that. The cloud is making decisions on your behalf based on what your demands are for performance versus cost. They're actually in the background. They're looking at these storage tiers. They're saying, this is how much data you have. This is how much performance you pay for. We're going to put most of that data on a hard drive or most of that data on solid state, depending on how you use it.
If you're doing it through AWS, whether it's in a hard drive or SSD, you as a user will feel the difference, even though it's through cloud.
In a sort of indirect way, you're more asking for a certain level of performance. Cloud is deciding how to deliver it to you. Even for cloud users, you're going to see increasingly people are going to shove a lot of data into the storage layer. They're going to put data into S3. They're going to put data into different parts of the system and not touch it as frequently. Upload a lot of videos and it doesn't get read or used all the time. How the cloud providers will manage it is they're going to increasingly put that data more on hard disks.
Right. No, I get that. Also, now that you mentioned the AI, now with the advent of AI, would it change the entire use case almost? Before you didn't have AI, you had like SQL or whatever. When you run query, you need to always be using SSD. Is always better performance. Now you have AI, maybe you don't need as much SSD storage or you can at least make it a more efficient allocation between hard drive and SSD.
There's like what engineers would call like highly interactive use cases where you're querying a database. You want the answer to come back fast. So most of the time that's going to be on an SSD. At least it's a lot easier for the engineer to put it on SSD because then they don't have to worry about performance. The performance is more predictable. When you're going to have this long tail of data that's more like videos, media, that naturally probably should live on a hard disk drive because you're not going to be accessing it all the time. Also, when you do access it, you're not searching for something. There's a difference between one big difference between an SSD and a hard disk drive is that SSDs are really good at what we call random access. You got a pile of documents and you can just look here and here and here and here, searching rapidly for something. That's something that SSDs are really good at. Hard disk drives can do that. They're not as good at it because inside a hard disk drive, there's actually a little needle that's moving around to read the data. So it actually takes time to physically move around. What they're better at is if you have a video and you're just going to read the whole video, it doesn't have to move around. The little spindle doesn't have to physically move very much, the data. Actually, these kind of use cases have been growing for the last decade. Especially China's been pushing them a lot within China because China, there's a lot of cameras.
I see.
Because the governments are putting together a lot of AI, machine learning technologies to make use of video, make use of audio data, putting it in cars. It's happening in the West as well, maybe at a slightly slower pace. There's all this data, there's all this video data. You want to be able to process the data, you want to glean insight from it, you want to be able to monitor things that are going on, look for things that are happening that are unusual. It's going to be enabled by AI. You need the ground truth. The ground truth video has to be stored somewhere. Maybe you process the video, maybe you turn it into like some insight. This is what happened in this 10-hour stretch of video. Mostly you look at those snippets. You always want to be able to go back to the original video that be stored somewhere.
Sure, got it. Is there a worry that solid state drives are going to, the cost of making those is going to drop so much that it will become on par with hard drives?
That's an interesting question. There was a time period, actually the last couple of decades, we saw the cost of solid state drives drop a lot. For a while, hard drive makers were like, there are actually quite a number of innovations in technology on the hard drive side that let them stay ahead of solid state drives. Is that going to continue? I haven't looked deeply into Seagate or Western Digital's technology roadmaps. I would expect they have plans to keep improving hard drives into the future. So that it's actually been surprising that hard drives versus SSDs have had this relative price difference that's been fairly stable for a couple of decades. The technology has been changing on both sides.
So they've been improving on both sides. The spread stays the same. Cool. Yep. I just looked it up while you were talking. You'll be surprised. Gross margin for Micron and Western Digital is actually quite similar. They're both at 40%, meaning that they actually get similar level of gross margin. It's not that SSD is much more profitable than HDDs. Cool. I guess the last thing is China going to, do you think, so the stuff that are used, the hard drives that are used in China today, who makes them?
I believe they're mostly imports from the West. Yeah.
From those two, Western Digital?
Yes. I didn't look very deeply into it. I would be surprised if there were like large Chinese hard drive makers that are at the frontier. Because the technology has been improving over time. It's mostly under patent, actually. So there's actually quite like interesting, if you're like a physics nerd, there's a lot of quite interesting things going on, like what the spindle actually does to bits of data onto little bits of basically like magnetic material. So if you actually zoom in on a modern hard drive and physically see how the data is being stored, every bit of data is only on a very, very tiny amount of material, basically. It's like a little magnetic, it's like a tiny little magnet with a different orientation. Those things it's achievable. It's just science and technology. I don't think China's been at the bleeding edge of building those things.
Cool. One last question I wanted to confirm with you is, why do you think Western Digital spin out SanDisk? Meaning that I think it probably supports your thesis that Western Digital sees value of HDD. They actually even prefer to be a pure play. Do you agree with that? Or
I didn't look deeply into the reasons for the spinoff. Operationally, there's probably not a lot of synergy. They did have different branding too.
One is consumer, one is probably more enterprise.
I associate SanDisk with more solid state stuff. Like if you just go and buy, you can buy a SanDisk SSD.
Yeah, using cameras and things like that. Cool. No, that's. I think that we're good for today. Cool. Let's try to do these. We'll see what people think, and let's try to do this once or twice a week.